Behind palace gates, under the veil of silence, a private ceremony took place, one the monarchy never intended the public to know about. But what happened inside shook the very traditions the crown was built on. And when Catherine made a bold choice that defied protocol, it wasn't just shocking, it sparked a royal divide that would turn allies into adversaries. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The royal family has always mastered the art of spectacle, but this ceremony wasn't meant for the cameras. It was planned in whispers, held behind doors thick enough to mute dissent, and executed with a precision that screamed control. Only the most senior royals were invited: King Charles, Queen Camilla, Prince William, Princess Anne and Catherine. It was described in internal memos as a continuity ritual, an homage to centuries-old customs tied to ancestral legacy. But behind the language of tradition, the event carried heavy political weight. It was meant to cement hierarchy, reinforce symbolism, and most importantly, showcase unity. Until Catherine rewrote the script. From the moment she entered, it was clear something was different. She arrived with the quiet poise that had become her hallmark, but those closest to her say she carried a silent resolve, as if prepared for confrontation. The ceremony, steeped in royal formality, began as expected. A blend of spoken vows, heirloom acknowledgements, and the presentation of a symbolic artifact reserved for senior royal women. But when it was Catherine's turn to participate in a key moment of the ritual, she didn't follow the script. She did not bow at the appointed time. She did not wear the emblem passed down through generations of Windsor women. Instead, she chose a subtle but striking alternative. And though nothing was said aloud, the shift in the room was palpable. Camilla reportedly exchanged a glance with Charles. William's expression, according to one observer, stiffened with confusion. And Anne, the only one who didn't appear shocked, kept her gaze fixed on Catherine, nodding ever so slightly. What Catherine did was simple on the surface. But within the context of the monarchy's obsession with control, it was explosive. Her gesture wasn't just personal, it was political. A deviation that questioned not just protocol, but the crown's emotional priorities. Some in the room reportedly viewed it as bold, even admirable. Others saw it as reckless, disrespectful, dangerous. But no matter how it was interpreted, one thing was undeniable: it disrupted the ceremonial flow and exposed the fragile choreography of a family built on appearance over authenticity. The palace, sensing the risk, acted fast. Within hours, aides were instructed to sanitize any trace of the deviation from internal records. They labeled it an alternate expression, hoped to keep it contained, and prayed it wouldn't reach the press. But the tension didn't stay hidden. And what followed wasn't silence, it was strategy. But before whispers could evolve into scandal, one royal stepped forward, not to condemn Catherine, but to defend her with unwavering force. She's known for her steel, her silence, and her refusal to meddle in palace drama, but this time, Princess Anne did something few expected. When critics circled Catherine like vultures, Anne did more than voice support. She challenged the throne itself to defend what Catherine stood for. The fallout from the ceremony rippled through the palace faster than anyone anticipated. What had been meant as a quiet show of unity was now fractured by speculation and dissent. Catherine's subtle act had ignited unrest, and behind closed doors, the whispers were turning into plans. Meetings were held, damage control strategies drafted, and in one of those strategy sessions, behind layers of formality and controlled tones, a storm rolled in named Anne. She wasn't on the invite list. She didn't wait for the right moment. She walked into the room and made it clear she wasn't asking for permission to speak. She had come to be heard. The aides in attendance froze. Even Charles was visibly taken aback. Anne rarely intervened. She'd built her entire royal career on restraint, on duty, on remaining above internal squabbles. But something about this moment, about the way Catherine was being handled, broke that silence. She didn't shout. She didn't rant. Her words were clear, surgical, and left no room for interpretation. She honored the moment in her own way, she said, voice even. You may not like how she did it, but it was not disrespect, it was necessary. No one dared respond. What Anne was saying wasn't just support. It was a warning. She accused certain members of the family and their inner circles of weaponizing tradition to enforce control. That Catherine's gesture was being used as a pretext for punishment, not because it threatened the institution, but because it challenged the people running it. Her statement didn't just defend Catherine's intentions, it attacked the motives of those condemning her. It was the kind of confrontation that left the room stunned, not because it was loud, but because it cut to the bone. According to an insider present during the meeting, Anne didn't stay long. She said what she came to say and left without waiting for agreement. The room didn't resume as normal. It couldn't. Her words had shattered the illusion that this was a manageable PR hiccup. It was now a matter of internal loyalty, and someone had drawn a line in the sand. For a brief moment, the plans to reprimand or reframe Catherine's actions were put on hold, not out of consensus, but out of caution, because when Anne speaks, even the firm listens. But what exactly had Catherine done that caused such fury, and why did Anne consider it worth risking her own standing to protect? It wasn't loud. It wasn't theatrical. But Catherine's quiet act during the private ceremony defied centuries of royal expectation. And once understood, it became clear this wasn't a mistake. It was a message, one that hit harder than any spoken words could. As the ceremonial procession neared its most sacred moment, the air was thick with formality. Every participant had been briefed on their role, every motion choreographed with the weight of tradition. And then came Catherine's turn. According to insiders, it was expected that she would don a specific royal emblem passed down through generations, an insignia worn by queens, duchesses and consorts since the early 1900s. It represented not just lineage but allegiance to the crown, to the system, to the rules. But when Catherine stepped forward, that emblem was nowhere to be seen. In its place was something no one had anticipated, a discreet, personalized symbol, reportedly honoring Princess Diana. It was subtle, deliberate, and devastatingly symbolic. This wasn't defiance for spectacle. This was a redefinition of allegiance. Catherine wasn't rejecting the monarchy. She was reclaiming something inside it. In choosing not to wear the emblem, she refused to be used as a ceremonial placeholder for legacy she didn't entirely believe in. And in wearing a symbol for Diana, she called forth a memory the crown had long tried to manage, contain, and in some ways control. The moment Catherine revealed her alternate symbol, the energy in the room shifted. Not just among the royals, but the aides too. It was a break from the script and no one was prepared for it. Charles, ever the guardian of image, was said to have tensed immediately. Camilla, standing nearby, exchanged a glance with a senior aide, her lips pressed tightly, eyes sharp with calculation. William, caught off guard, said nothing. He reportedly hadn't been informed. Whether that was by accident or design remains unclear. But what followed was an awkward stutter in the ritual, a pause that should never have happened, and then a clumsy continuation that left behind the air of something fractured. Behind the scenes, chaos followed. Aides quickly drafted internal statements, labeling the change a miscommunication. They claimed Catherine had been working from outdated guidance, that there was no intended disrespect. But those inside knew better. Catherine had been briefed thoroughly, weeks in advance. Nothing she wore that day was accidental. It was a choice, and a deeply personal one. In private, some royals called it unnecessary. Others called it dangerous. But for Catherine, it was necessary because it was dangerous. She had not just participated in the ceremony, she had reshaped it. Without saying a word, she had shifted its meaning. From loyalty to legacy. From hierarchy to history. And the royal family, so carefully draped in silence and stability, had been shaken by a gesture no one could undo. But it wasn't miscommunication, it was intention. And that intention exposed the fragile fault lines running beneath the royal family's united image. She didn't scream. She didn't argue. But Camilla's reaction to Catherine's defiance was so frosted, insiders say the temperature in the room dropped instantly. Her response wasn't about correcting protocol, it was about reminding everyone who held real influence behind palace doors. The ceremony may have ended, but the consequences of Catherine's silent act had just begun to unfold. As guests filed out, and aides exchanged uneasy glances, Camilla made her move. With the elegance of a queen and the calculation of a strategist, she approached Catherine in private, close enough to avoid being overheard, but not so discreet as to conceal her intent. According to those nearby, her voice was low and calm. Too calm. "You may not realize what you've done," she reportedly said, "but there are consequences for dividing the family." On the surface, it sounded like concern. But to those familiar with royal code, it was a warning dressed in silk. Camilla didn't raise her voice, she didn't need to. Her strength had always been subtle control, the kind that doesn't confront in public but punishes in silence. Aides who witnessed the exchange later described her tone as soft-voiced but threatening. Catherine didn't respond. She didn't have to. The statement had been made during the ceremony. What followed would be fought not with titles but tactics. And Camilla's next moves came swiftly. Within hours, select tabloids began printing pieces that appeared eerily aligned. Headlines referenced internal tension caused by unexpected behavior, and unnamed palace insiders cited concerns over emotional instability and impulsive choices. The language wasn't neutral, it was surgical. While Catherine was still recovering from the emotional weight of her decision, Camilla's circle had already begun reframing the narrative. And the press? They took the bait. Senior aides denied involvement. The palace issued no formal statement. But behind closed doors, no one doubted where the whispers had originated. Camilla's network of loyal courtiers had long been effective at protecting her image, and now, it seemed, they were just as adept at reshaping someone else's. Catherine wasn't just being punished for breaking protocol, she was being publicly questioned for daring to redefine it. But not everyone remained silent. Princess Anne, ever watchful, had seen the exchange. And more importantly, she had recognized the shift. This wasn't palace procedure. This was character assassination. And if Camilla thought she could tighten her grip while the world looked away, she underestimated the one royal who had nothing left to fear and no intention of letting power go unchecked. And when the press began to spin the story, Princess Anne took a bold and unexpected step to shut it all down. Statements from royals are supposed to be cleared by the palace press office. But not this one. Anne issued her own, unfiltered, unapologetic words to a trusted journalist and made it crystal clear where her loyalty stood. The crown had a new problem. A princess at war with silence. The palace was still reeling from the fallout of Catherine's symbolic defiance when another shockwave hit, and this one didn't come from Catherine. It came from Anne. Known for her disciplined reserve and loyalty to tradition, Anne had spent decades being the monarchy's quiet backbone. But this time, she acted alone and against every unwritten rule. In a move that defied every standard of royal protocol, she sent a personal statement unvetted, unapproved to a journalist with deep ties to the palace. It wasn't a leak, it was a declaration. The message was short, but there was no mistaking its meaning. Anne condemned the troubling pattern of weaponized tradition that had taken root behind palace walls. She didn't name names. She didn't need to. The language was searing, surgical, and unmistakably aimed at those who had tried to undermine Catherine. She spoke of moments when symbolism had been used as a shield for ego, and warned of what would happen if the monarchy continued to punish integrity under the guise of maintaining image. The statement was published within hours, and once it hit the front pages, the palace press office spiraled into damage control. Charles's senior aides demanded an immediate retraction. Legal teams were quietly contacted. Back-channel calls were made to the journalist. But it was too late. The public had seen it. Screenshots were everywhere. And for the first time in years, the stoic Princess Royal was being heralded as a modern heroine. The public reaction was swift and fiery. Social media flooded with praise for Anne's courage, applauding her for breaking through the palace's wall of silence. Support for Catherine surged. Hashtags trended. Royal commentators who had tiptoed around the story now spoke more openly. The narrative was shifting and not in the crown's favour. Within the palace, tension reached a breaking point. Charles was reportedly blindsided, deeply frustrated that Anne had gone rogue. But even he couldn't publicly rebuke her. Anne's reputation, both internally and among the public, was beyond reproach. To criticise her was to alienate the one royal whose loyalty had never been questioned until now. Anne's words had done more than support Catherine. They had exposed a fracture the monarchy couldn't stitch together quietly. The firm had always survived through unity, or at least the illusion of it. But Anne had ripped the curtain wide open. Her actions weren't just bold, they were revolutionary. But as public support grew, palace insiders were already preparing to retaliate with their own version of the truth. It was meant to stay hidden, a confidential palace memo outlining how to reframe the narrative around Catherine's breach of tradition. But when it leaked to the press, it exposed the ruthless media machinery working behind palace walls and confirmed fears of a coordinated smear campaign. The document, marked strictly internal and circulated among senior communications staff, was never intended to be seen beyond a select circle. Yet, within days of Anne's explosive defence and the public's surge of support for Catherine, someone from inside leaked the memo. Its content was damning not just in tone, but in what it revealed about the palace's intentions. The memo described Catherine's symbolic gesture as a breach of ceremonial discipline, framing her quiet defiance as a disruption, not a message. But what caught the public's attention most were the lines that followed. It recommended immediate measures to counterbalance the impact of the deviation by reinforcing legacy reputations. A phrase that, while diplomatic on the surface, was quickly decoded by analysts and royal insiders alike. This wasn't just about tradition, it was about contrast. The memo called for reminders of figures whose unwavering loyalty to the crown has defined public trust, a veiled directive to reframe Camilla's image, and more subtly, to revive the monarchy's narrative of control by using Diana's memory against Catherine. It was cruel, calculated, and unmistakably strategic. Even more telling was a section referencing Princess Anne. It didn't dismiss her, it feared her. The memo labelled her defence of Catherine as unexpected resistance requiring careful internal positioning, suggesting she was to be acknowledged publicly but isolated privately. The implication was clear: Anne had become a liability, and the firm was prepared to contain her influence too. To blunt the backlash, the final portion of the document laid out a plan for redemptive optics. This included planting stories of reconciliation, orchestrating friendly photo ops, and having unnamed insiders quietly push the idea that Catherine had simply misunderstood protocol and had already apologized behind closed doors. It was a textbook move: control the visuals, manipulate the message, and hope the headlines reset the public memory. But this time, it didn't work. The leak infuriated the public. Social media erupted, not just in defense of Catherine, but in outrage over the level of manipulation exposed. For years, people had speculated about the palace's grip on the media. Now they had proof. The image of unity had always been curated, but now that illusion was shattered in writing. And yet, amid the outrage, there was one question no leak, no memo, and no narrative control could suppress. It echoed through palace walls and across public forums alike. Why now? Why did Catherine choose this exact moment to break from tradition? What pushed her to take that risk, knowing what the cost would be? But in the middle of the chaos, one question kept haunting those closest to Catherine. Why did she break tradition now? It wasn't impulsive. It wasn't rebellious. The truth behind Catherine's decision wasn't about symbolism alone, it was about grief, legacy, and a promise made in private. And once revealed, it reframed everything. Long before the private ceremony, before the press headlines, and before Princess Anne's historic defense, Catherine had been carrying something silently. According to a trusted confidante, she had confided months earlier that she felt Diana's memory was being erased, not honored. Time had passed, but so had intention. Public tributes faded into curated displays. The monarchy had moved on, but in doing so, had pushed aside the woman who had in many ways redefined what it meant to be royal in the modern age. Diana's name was still spoken, but her presence had been sanitized, her fire replaced with safe nostalgia. And Catherine, who had once looked to Diana as more than a predecessor, felt that loss growing louder with each passing year. It wasn't the first time she tried to formally honor her late mother-in-law. Insiders recall several quiet attempts, design requests, subtle speeches, symbolic touches, all of which were either blocked or edited into irrelevance. The resistance was subtle but firm. Anything overtly connected to Diana, especially within ceremonial context, was discouraged. There were fears, apparently, that invoking Diana's legacy too strongly would stir ghosts best left undisturbed. Catherine disagreed, but for a long time she complied. Until the ceremony. Until she decided that silence was no longer safe. The symbol she introduced that day, stitched delicately, quietly, beneath her formal attire, was not random. It was something Diana had once sketched in private. A piece of personal meaning that had never seen the public eye. Only a few knew of it, and Catherine had protected its significance for years. But when the palace demanded uniformity for a ceremony steeped in tradition, she chose something different. Not to rebel, but to remember. She had no illusions about the cost. She knew there would be backlash. That people would talk. That critics would twist the gesture into selfishness, or frame it as emotional instability. But she did it anyway. Because for Catherine, it wasn't about protocol. It was about conscience. It was about doing what no one else seemed willing to do, speak Diana's name not as a relic, but as a living memory. She didn't need applause. She didn't need headlines. What she needed was to look in the mirror and know she hadn't let another chance slip by to do what was right. When this truth began to surface, when quiet confirmations and insider leaks revealed the real reason behind Catherine's choice, the tone of public discussion shifted. What had been seen as recklessness became courage. What was once viewed as defiance was now a tribute. And the palace, so practiced in sculpting its message, began to realize it was no longer the only voice shaping the story. And as the truth surfaced, public opinion turned, and the palace suddenly found itself losing control of the narrative it built. Behind the scenes, the firm was fracturing. Sides were being taken. Catherine and Anne stood on one side, advocates for quiet reform. On the other, those clinging to tradition, fearful of what one deviation might unravel. And at the center, the monarchy's future hung in the balance. What began as a symbolic act had spiraled into something far greater. Inside the palace, senior staff found themselves divided not by loyalty alone, but by ideology. Some, particularly within Charles's inner circle, believed the response to Catherine's breach needed to be firm and swift. They argued that a precedent had been set, and if left unchecked, it would only encourage further disruptions to protocol. Others, many of them younger and more in tune with public sentiment, warned that overreacting would only further alienate the people and risk igniting a public firestorm that couldn't be extinguished. The atmosphere grew colder by the hour. Emails turned combative. Briefings became tense. It wasn't just about Catherine anymore, it was about control. William, perhaps more than anyone, found himself caught in the crosshairs. Torn between his role as future king and his loyalty as a husband, he tried to straddle the line, but the pressure was relentless. Charles, already frustrated by Anne's public stance, made it clear that William needed to help restore unity. But behind closed doors, William reportedly told a trusted aide that Catherine had his full support. Still, he stopped short of defending her publicly, something that didn't go unnoticed within palace walls or beyond. Camilla, meanwhile, was pushing for consequences. Those close to her say she lobbied for a formal reprimand, not just to preserve the sanctity of tradition, but to reassert her own authority. A senior staffer described her tone in internal meetings as unapologetic and absolute. She didn't see Catherine's act as a tribute. She saw it as a threat to the hierarchy she had fought for decades to become a part of. Her position was clear. Leniency was not an option. And then came another line in the sand. A follow-up meeting was called to discuss a protocol recovery strategy. Anne, expected to attend, refused. She didn't send an excuse. She simply didn't go. Her absence said everything. She would not participate in a plan to spin or suppress Catherine's actions. And that bold silence reverberated through the palace louder than any speech. Catherine, for her part, maintained her public silence. But behind palace walls, she began reaching out to allies quietly, purposefully. Those conversations weren't just about survival. They were about intention. Reform was no longer just a hope. It was a movement, however small, anchored by two women who refused to let fear dictate history. The divide now ran deeper than press strategy or ceremonial symbols. It was emotional, generational, and dangerously close to becoming irreversible. Advisors whispered that this was the worst internal fracture since Meghan's departure, and in some ways even more volatile, because this time the rebellion wasn't coming from outside the family. And just when the storm seemed ready to consume the crown, an unexpected twist brought everything to a halt, if only briefly. When King Charles finally intervened, the damage had already been done. His attempt to unite the family behind closed doors came not from power but desperation. What began as a simple ceremony had become a symbol of rebellion, resistance, and reform. And the monarchy would never be the same. The private meeting was hastily arranged, no press, no aides, no official briefing papers, just the key figures seated around a long, narrow table where formality hung heavy in the air. Charles had hoped that by gathering the core players, Catherine, Camilla, William, Anne, he could pull the narrative back under control. But the atmosphere was not one of unity. It was thinly veiled tension, years of unspoken truths floating just beneath the surface. What had once been about a single symbolic deviation was now a boiling point for a dozen buried grievances. The monarchy's immaculate image had cracked, and behind the gilded curtain was a family fraying at the seams. Charles opened the conversation not with accusation, but with admission. He acknowledged failings in internal communication, a phrase chosen with surgical care to sound diplomatic without conceding too much. But those in the room knew it was more than communication that had failed. It was trust. Camilla, seated at his side, remained expressionless. When Charles gently suggested that mistakes had been made on all sides, Camilla reportedly turned to him and, in a tone only those closest could recognize, reminded him that decorum and loyalty must come first. She offered no apology, no softening. She would not back down. Not for Catherine, not for Anne, not even for the king. Anne, ever the realist, didn't escalate. But she didn't retreat either. She reiterated what she had said from the beginning. Catherine had acted with intention and dignity. If we punish authenticity, she reportedly said, we punish growth. Her words hung in the room like a challenge no one dared to answer. William, caught between duty and devotion, said little. His presence alone conveyed his internal conflict. He looked toward Catherine, perhaps expecting her to speak. But she remained still, calm, silent. Not because she had nothing to say, but because she had already said it, without needing to raise her voice. The meeting continued in circles, civil, cold and inconclusive. No final resolution was agreed upon. No press strategy was announced. It ended with Charles issuing a single warning: the walls are thinner than you think. It was a statement born from fear. Fear that what had happened behind palace doors was no longer contained. That silence was no longer protection, but a signal to sharpen the knives. The message was clear. The era of quiet obedience was over. The monarchy would either adapt or be defined by those brave enough to question it. Because in this new era of the monarchy, silence doesn't protect the crown, it only sharpens the knives drawn behind it. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.